As a streamer whose main game is old school RuneScape, I'm often asked a question by people who saw me on other YouTube channels and decided to check out my Twitch. Why is this game called old school RuneScape? Is there a new school RuneScape? To which the simplest answer is, kind of. There are indeed two different games with the name RuneScape, and the games have a common ancestor. To help assist in the confusion, this video will address each version of the game, the history of why the two versions exist, as well as the long-standing animosity between the fans of these eternally connected but now vastly different games. To explain why there are two versions of RuneScape, and to be as clear as possible with the working names during the different eras of the game, we have to go back to the beginning. Once upon a time, there was a single game known only as RuneScape, and surprisingly, it was made up of two-dimensional sprites and was barely recognizable as either of the RuneScape timelines today. Though the game was hand-drawn, maddeningly difficult, and buggy, it had a charm to it that gave it a dedicated player base, and it was groundbreaking as an online game in real time, one of the earliest Dungeons & Dragons style RPGs to be able to prefix itself with MMO. This version of the game became available for public play in early 2001, and while RuneScape became financially successful after the members version of the game launched later that year, graphics of the era were moving far beyond the charming but Napoleon Dynamite-esque drawings that this deep and still expanding young MMO had to offer. In the spirit of staying with the times, the creators of RuneScape began a complete engine rework to bring the sprites of the game into the third dimension. Gone would be the days of forced perspective and every NPC only having 2 or 3 angles. This would be RuneScape as it was meant to be. A truly immersive land of adventure and medieval escapades with graphics so realistic and frightening. What the hell is that thing? Anyways, RuneScape's graphical rework was such a massive project that it was called RuneScape 2 by Jagex. It was heavily advertised and teased by the company, and screenshots showing what would become the iconic and distinctive RuneScape style were released onto the website. But there was an issue. Many players had spent countless hours of their lives honing their skills in RuneScape. A great percentage of them didn't want to migrate over to this new RuneScape 2. Their items and levels were of great importance to them, and they didn't feel a need for a new graphical style and a complete rework of the combat system. What about those players? Believe it or not, this issue will come up again in this video. In order to help incentivize the mass migration from RuneScape to RuneScape 2, Jagex declared that all items and stats would transfer over to the new game. This did ease the concerns of many players who were scared that they would have to start over or lose their prestigious and rare items, but it did have unintended consequences. Jagex created some of the rarest and most valuable items in the game by doing this, in some instances because items that were considered obsolete or redundant during the creation of RuneScape 2 were omitted from the game, but still allowed to transfer in. And in even rarer cases, accounts began their RuneScape 2 journey with only 9 hit points, due to early RuneScape having a class system before scrapping it. RuneScape 2's beta became available for play in 2003, and the transfers of willing accounts from one game to the other happened in 2004, just a few months before I started playing. Though this transfer had its downsides, it was regarded as a success, and the original version of the game still had dedicated servers for players who wished to continue living the two-dimensional dream. But Jagex had large aspirations for RuneScape 2, and to prevent confusion amongst their targeted demographic of young teenagers for the predicted influx of new players, the two-dimensional version of the game came to be called RuneScape Classic, and the new three-dimensional game took the coveted title of simply being RuneScape. RuneScape Classic would cease to receive updates or even bot bans as the new version of the game took priority, and as RuneScape grew to completely dominate middle school computer labs worldwide in the mid to late 2000s, the creator and majority owner of the game, Andrew Gower, would eventually step down in 2010, ushering in an era of some of the most poorly received updates the game would ever know, after already having had a few blemishes. In 2008, the ability to freely trade as well as to receive other players' loot from player versus player combat was removed, to combat scammers who use stolen credit cards to buy Jagex membership and then charge back the money. This was the single most damaging decision in the history of the game, at that time. Hordes of players quit the game as they lost the ability to let friends borrow their coveted weapons or give gifts to their clanmates, and player killers, a thriving and vast community that had been a staple of the game since its inception, no longer had any reason to hunt. This year also included a graphical update that was poorly received by many, as the flailing arms and whips while standing still seemed odd in a game that, while admittedly aging, was beloved for its charming graphics and had a dedicated player base. Whether you loved it or hated it, high-definition RuneScape in 2008 was considered for many to be the beginning of a years-long string of updates that completely invalidated content that existed before it, or was so overpowered that the new items were a must-have. This worsened over the years as different CEOs took over Jagex, and in 2012, the Squeal of Fortune was introduced, a daily spin on a wheel with outrageous rewards ranging from minuscule amounts of arrows to nearly maximum stacks of cash. When Jagex began to sell additional spins on the wheel for real-world money, the beginning of the end was nigh. Players revolted over the introduction of microtransactions, and even though free trade had been reinstated some years earlier, the game was now being flooded with lucky versions of items that were untradeable and account-bound, and almost negated the demand for their actual counterparts, and huge amounts of cash that were delivered straight from Jagex to the player's coin pouch. Hit points had been multiplied by 10 and became a skill called Constitution just to seem more RPG-ish, I guess. Almost every skill in the game had been made free into AFK, and another armor and graphical rework had divided the game once more. In short, for those of us who had played the game lovingly since 2007 and before, the game had become unrecognizable. I, myself, as a daily dedicated player, was struggling to keep up with the amounts of new armors, buffs, and items that were pouring into the game, and seeing a new player swipe a credit card and instantly surpass the progress of the entire history of my account was incredibly demotivating. This controversy raged until the true annihilator of the game would come along. The single update so controversial and poorly received that over 90% of the player base immediately quit, and the company had to resort to desperate measures to prevent bankruptcy. The evolution of combat. RuneScape, since its inception, had operated entirely as a point-and-click game. Over the years, the developers of the game struggled to find ways to incorporate more challenges with what they felt was a fundamental limitation to advancing the player versus monster aspect of the game. The tick-based combat system where actions are registered only every 0.6 seconds, and the point-click input that had no special abilities or powers building up passively, as is commonly seen in, well, every single MMORPG besides RuneScape. Despite players almost unanimously complaining and even rioting to protest this complete overhaul of the entire game, Jagex proceeded without a care, and near the end of 2012, the evolution of combat made its way into the live game, bringing dual-wielded weapons, removing poison from the game entirely, and being so riddled with bugs that some PVM drops became worthless overnight, if worthless is even a concept in a game where almost every single player has already quit. While it is vastly different today than it was at the time of its release and should not be judged based on the community's reaction from 2012, it is beyond debate that this update killed the game. And besides the relatively small amount of players who were dumping out their credit cards for the new cosmetics, boosted XP, and max cash stacks directly from Jagex, there was no income from a healthy amount of membership, as had historically been the case. RuneScape was in trouble, but one player had a crazy idea to save it. In early 2013, a RuneScape content creator known as So Wrecked began hyping up an idea that had come and gone several times through the dark years of RuneScape updates. The idea of a preserved, gone version of RuneScape, something closer to the time of release, and what many players consider to be the game's golden era. This idea gathered massive amounts of support, as Jagex seemed to realize that most of their players loved RuneScape for being RuneScape. Most of them had tried other number key style fighting games with abilities and adrenaline, and had chosen to remain with RuneScape for any number of reasons. The call would become too loud to ignore after Jagex shut down a private server that aimed to provide RuneScape servers from 2006, and received over 100,000 players signing up for accounts. People wanted to play RuneScape, but they wanted it to be the game they'd fallen in love with. And on February 22nd of 2013, the old-school RuneScape servers were finally released, despite internal expectations that this version of the game would last about 6 months before financially drying up and having to be shut down. Old-school RuneScape recently celebrated its 10th birthday since release, and its average player count is higher than ever. So old-school RuneScape was released in 2013, but was based off of a copy of the game that was saved on August 10th, 2007. A few weeks prior to one of the biggest and most iconic RuneScape updates of all time, the God Wars dungeon. This version of the game had very few quality of life updates at all, and the player base at this time was vehemently against them. Players were extremely upset about having to start from scratch and lose all of their items and thousands of hours of skilling, but were excited to have the nostalgic adventure that they'd embarked upon as children easily available once again. This very first release of old school RuneScape would be unrecognizable even to players today. The Grand Exchange did not exist and was incredibly controversial. There was no way to know what type of herb you had if you couldn't identify it, because cleaning herbs wasn't a thing yet. Overall, it was exactly what players had dreamt of, and most importantly, Jagex essentially promised not to ruin this game with tons of unneeded, unwanted updates by instating a polling system. And though the parameters of what counts as a pass or a fail have changed over the years, as Jagex have inadvertently wasted many hours creating content that ultimately gets swatted down at the polls, they have stuck to this promise for the last 10 years. Although integrity changes to certain drops or the stats of gear have been implemented, every major piece of content from bosses to rewards has to be agreed on by the vast majority of the player base, and the content is put to a poll. Over the years, attitudes towards what is and isn't considered easy-scape have changed. I myself went from being a player who wouldn't dare set foot on the continent of Zeah because it was new school RuneScape, to voting yes on a new skill. Old school RuneScape began with only 3 developers in a small corner of Jagex, but has received updates and content consistently since its release. Even since before the developers had the actual tools to make new sprites and models within the game and could only recolor existing assets. They released RuneScape's first ever raid, in fact 3 now. The solo challenge most players will never complete, known as the Inferno. They introduced balanced, carefully considered gear across a large array of content. Players have worked with Jagex to create this version of the game, and the formula has proven successful, as OSRS has maintained its highest non-lockdown player average since the release of the servers. At times, even getting somewhat close to the glory days. While this game has been officially called Old School RuneScape since it came out, players of both games, of course, still refer to the game that they play as RuneScape. Because of the huge change in mechanics, as well as to differentiate between the versions, the Evolution of Combat version would come to be known as RuneScape 3, though it is also referred to as the main game by Jagex employees, as it is officially the holder of the title of RuneScape. RuneScape 3 survived through the dark times of a nearly non-existent player count in the early days of Old School's release. Bonds were released on both versions of the game, allowing players to essentially buy gold from Jagex by purchasing an item that gave in-game membership, and a financial surge at the company allowed both games to continue running. This allowed more time to refine the evolution of combat in the game, and to also incorporate an optional legacy mode for players who knew how to fight with clicks on RuneScape, but weren't warming up to the number pad system. Though the content is not polled for the community, the team of developers at RuneScape 3 is just as passionate about the game as those at OSRS, and the game has had a resurgence of popularity as well as health in the last few years. Many new skills have come into the game that exist in no form in Old School RuneScape, and Old School has also somewhat borrowed content from RS3 many times, such as the introduction of powered tridents that were a new take on the Polypore staff, and Zenite jewelry being based off of Hydrix, though the community hates hearing that content was even partially inspired by the main game. As you can imagine, the two games have essentially been mortal enemies since the release of the older version, with one side accusing the other of being too stupid to modernize, and the opposition accusing them of only gaining accomplishments with the use of their mother's credit cards. For some reason, there will be people in the comments section saying these things. There will be idiots saying RuneScape 3 is better, and there will be morons saying Old School RuneScape is superior. Don't listen to either of them, because neither one of them is right. It's a matter of your opinion. Despite the accursed common ancestry of these games that gives both of them the name RuneScape, the simple and blatant fact of the matter is that they are now two very different games. There's simply no reason to compare them to each other and to make an ass of yourself. I don't see someone playing Final Fantasy and randomly give them a 10-paragraph monologue about why EverQuest is better. I'm just glad that they're having fun playing video games and being distracted from whatever problems might be bothering them. In the same way, nobody can convince me that one game is better than the other, and the point is moot. I prefer Old School RuneScape, but that doesn't make me right. The only way to know which game is for you is to give them a shot. Or try one, and if it feels good, don't listen to what anyone else tells you. That's the beauty of RuneScape, whether it's 1, 2, or 3. You choose the adventure, you make your story, and nobody can tell you that you're doing it wrong. Jump into either one of the Gielinors, and feel free to join the clan chat from whichever game you're playing. As long as these servers are running, I'll see you there.